The river moved with a deceptive calm that day, hiding the violence that would soon disturb its peaceful surface. They thought no one would see, that the rushing waters would erase all evidence of their cruelty. But they didn't count on him watching from the shadows of the ranch house, his weathered eyes catching the glint of struggle at the water's edge. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The bitter spring morning brought a chill that cut deeper than weather alone. Along the rocky banks of the Laramie River, nearly half of Ridgewater had gathered, their faces hard as the Wyoming Territory itself. Rain spattered against leather coats and woolen shawls, but nobody moved to seek shelter. They had come for something they called justice. Eleanor Hayes stood trembling at the river's edge, her wrists raw from the rough rope binding them. Her dark hair whipped across her face in the wind, and her eyes darted from person to person, searching desperately for a sympathetic gaze among the sea of accusers. Just 3 days ago, she had been merely another face in town. Now, she was their villain. "I didn't do it," Eleanor pleaded, her voice barely audible above the rushing water and growing murmurs. "I wasn't anywhere near the barns that night." Cornelius Vega stepped forward from the crowd, his expensive coat marking him as different from the working folk surrounding him. The wealthy rancher's cattle barns had burned to ash 2 nights prior, and his influence had quickly focused the town's suspicion on Eleanor. "A drifter with no ties to our community," Vega announced, gesturing toward the accused woman. "Seen near my property before the fire. What more proof do we need?" Marshal Tate Hensley stood nearby, badge gleaming dully in the gray morning light. The lawman shifted his weight uncomfortably, authority visibly crumbling beneath the pressure of Vega's stare. His hand rested on his firearm, but whether to protect Eleanor or enforce the mob's will remained unclear. "We should wait," the marshal suggested weakly. "Give the investigation time." "Time for what?" shouted someone from the crowd. "For more of our livelihoods to burn?" Eleanor fell to her knees on the muddy bank. "Please," she begged. "I'm innocent." The townsfolk pressed closer, their collective anger building like the storm clouds overhead. A shopkeeper's wife spat at Eleanor's feet. A ranch hand muttered about witchcraft. The church deacon looked away, his silence a betrayal of his Sunday sermons on mercy. When the first hands grabbed her shoulders, Eleanor screamed. More hands joined, lifting her struggling form. Marshal Hensley took 2 steps forward, then stopped, his courage failing under Vega's cold stare. "Let the river judge her," someone called out. The crowd surged forward. Eleanor's feet left the ground as strong arms swung her toward the churning waters of the Laramie. The current ran high and fast with spring melt, brown and angry as the mob itself. Her body hit the icy water with a splash that seemed impossibly small compared to the weight of the moment. Eleanor's scream cut short as the river claimed her, the roaring waters drowning her cries as efficiently as the town had silenced her pleas for mercy. Rhett Callahan had seen enough injustice in his 36 years on the frontier. Without a moment's hesitation, he shoved through the crowd of onlookers, ignoring their gasps and protests. The rancher tore off his heavy coat and boots in 3 swift movements before launching himself into the churning waters of the Laramie River. The shock of cold hit him like a physical blow. The spring melt had turned the normally placid river into a roaring beast, its icy fingers immediately soaking through his clothes and pulling at his limbs. Rhett could hear Marshal Tate Hensley shouting something from the bank, but the words were lost beneath the water's roar. Years of drought and loss had hardened the rancher's resolve. He had already lost his brother to injustice, watching helplessly as pneumonia took him after a night spent in Tate's leaky jail cell on trumped-up charges. That failure haunted his dreams. The faces of those he couldn't save flickered through his mind as he fought against the current, his powerful arms cutting through the water with desperate determination. 20 yards downstream, he caught a glimpse of Eleanor's pale blue dress billowing beneath the surface. The accused woman was thrashing weakly, her bound hands making it impossible to swim. Rhett dove deeper, the murky water stinging his eyes as he reached for her. His fingers brushed fabric once, twice, then finally closed around her wrist. Eleanor's eyes, wide with terror, met his beneath the water. With a powerful kick, he pulled them both toward the surface, breaking through with a desperate gasp that burned his lungs. "I've got you," he sputtered, spitting river water as he wrapped one arm around her waist. Her body was limp against his, but he could feel her trembling. "Stay with me." The current dragged them further downstream, away from Ridgewater and the mob that had so easily condemned her. Rhett fought to keep their heads above water while searching for a place to make land. Eleanor's breathing came in ragged gasps against his shoulder. "Why?" she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible above the rushing water. Rhett didn't answer immediately, focusing instead on angling them toward the far bank where the river widened and slowed. Only when his boots scraped against the rocky riverbed did he speak, his voice low and fierce in her ear. "Not while I'm alive," he said, the words a promise and a defiance. "They don't get to decide who lives and who drowns. Not today." Eleanor Hayes sagged against him as he half-carried, half-dragged her onto the muddy shore, both of them coughing and shivering. Behind them, across the water, the townsfolk of Ridgewater had already begun to scatter, some pointing and shouting. The rancher knew what this meant. He had just made himself an accomplice in their eyes. Rhett Callahan and Eleanor Hayes collapsed on the muddy eastern bank of the Laramie River, both gasping for breath as water streamed from their sodden clothes. The rancher's powerful arms trembled from exertion as he helped the woman to her feet. Eleanor's bound hands were raw and bleeding where the rough rope had cut into her skin during their desperate struggle against the current. "You all right?" Rhett asked, his voice barely audible above the roaring waters. Before she could answer, shouts erupted from the opposite shore. The townsfolk of Ridgewater had recovered from their momentary shock and were now pointing accusingly across the river. Marshal Tate Hensley stood at the forefront, his badge gleaming dully in the gray morning light as he cupped his hands around his mouth. "Callahan," the lawman bellowed, "what in God's name do you think you're doing?" Cornelius Vega pushed through the crowd to stand beside the marshal, his expensive coat unmarred by the morning's violence. The wealthy rancher's face contorted with rage as he pointed a gloved finger at the pair. "See there? He was waiting for her. This was planned," Vega shouted, his influence immediately taking hold among the onlookers. Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. Farmers and shopkeepers, who had nodded respectfully to Rhett just yesterday, now eyed him with suspicion. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the mob's collective memory rewrote itself in real time. Always kept to himself, that Callahan. Never did trust a man who wouldn't drink at the Silver Spur. Birds of a feather, ain't they? Marshal Hensley adjusted his gun belt, a gesture that seemed more performance than necessity. "I'm declaring you an accessory, Callahan. You harboring a criminal makes you just as guilty." Eleanor shivered violently, partly from the cold river water and partly from fear. "You shouldn't have done this," she whispered. "Now they'll come for you too." Rhett stood tall, despite his drenched clothes clinging to his frame. Let them try. That evening, Ridgewater buzzed with fresh rumors. At the general store, at church gatherings, and especially at the saloon, the story grew with each telling. By nightfall, half the town believed Rhett had helped Eleanor torch Vega's barns. The other half merely suspected it. Miriam Callahan heard the whispers when she came to town for supplies. The widow clutched her purchases tightly as former friends turned away from her, their silence more damning than any accusation. The marshal posted notices seeking information about the criminal conspiracy, offering rewards that would tempt even the most loyal ranch hands. As darkness fell over the Wyoming territory, the threat of arrest hung in the air like the coming storm. Inevitable and merciless. The Callahan Ranch stood like a weathered sentinel against the Wyoming sky, its fence posts and barn boards silvered by years of sun and snow. Rhett Callahan guided his horse through the gate with Eleanor Hayes slumped against his back, both of them soaked to the bone and shivering from their ordeal in the Laramie River. The ranch hands paused in their work, eyes following the pair with undisguised curiosity and suspicion. "Get back to work," Rhett called out, his voice carrying across the yard. The men reluctantly returned to their tasks, but their sideways glances spoke volumes. Eleanor dismounted with difficulty, her bound wrists now free but marked with angry red welts. She took in the sprawling property with its modest main house, sturdy barn, and the constant symphony of the windmill creaking in the breeze. After the violence at the river, the ranch's ordinary sounds, cattle lowing in the distance, chickens scratching in the dirt, seemed almost surreal. "You'll stay in the spare room," Rhett said, leading her toward the house. "It's not much, but it's dry." Inside, Miriam Callahan stood in the kitchen doorway, her face a mask of concern. The widow's hands twisted her apron as she watched her brother-in-law usher in the woman the entire town had just tried to drown. "Rhett, what have you done?" she whispered, eyes darting to the window as if expecting to see the mob following behind. "What needed doing, Miriam?" he replied, his tone brooking no argument. "Eleanor needs dry clothes and something warm to drink." Miriam hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "The children are at the neighbors. Thank heaven for small mercies." Later, dressed in borrowed clothes that hung loose on her frame, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, cradling a steaming cup between her palms. The warmth seemed to reach places inside her that had gone cold long before the river. "You've put yourself in danger," she said quietly to Rhett. "Your family, too." The rancher looked up from stoking the fire. "Wouldn't be the first time this family's faced trouble." Miriam entered, carrying fresh linens. "But it might be the last," she countered. "Cornelius Vega isn't a man who forgives being crossed, and Marshal Hensley follows wherever Vega leads." Her eyes met Eleanor's. "I lost my husband 2 winters ago. These children need stability, not more grief." The uneasy silence was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Rhett moved to the window, hand instinctively moving to his hip where his firearm rested. "Just Hank coming back with supplies," he said, relaxing slightly. Eleanor set down her cup. "I won't stay if it brings harm to your family." "You'll stay," Rhett said firmly, "until we figure this out." Outside, the windmill blades continued their endless rotation, marking time in a world that had suddenly become much more dangerous for everyone under the Callahan roof. Eleanor Hayes crept through the skeletal remains of Cornelius Vega's cattle barns as dawn broke over Ridgewater. The acrid smell of charred wood still hung heavy in the air 3 days after the fire. She pulled her shawl tighter, glancing over her shoulder. Being caught here would only cement her guilt in the town's eyes. With trembling fingers, Eleanor sifted through blackened debris, her determination outweighing her fear. The accusations had stripped away everything but her resolve to uncover the truth. As she moved deeper into the ruins, something caught her eye, a section of timber that didn't match the burn pattern of the surrounding wood. "This wasn't an accident," she whispered, carefully examining the charred beam. The burn marks revealed a deliberate pattern, concentrated in a way that natural spreading fire wouldn't create. Someone had doused this spot with accelerant. Eleanor broke off a piece of the evidence, wrapping it carefully in her handkerchief. The young woman made her way to Rhett Callahan's ranch by midday, hope burning brighter than it had in weeks. The rancher listened intently as she laid out her discovery, his weathered face thoughtful. "This could prove you were framed," Rhett said, turning the charred wood over in his calloused hands. "But Vega has half the town in his pocket. We need more than this." That afternoon, Eleanor insisted on presenting her findings to Marshal Tate Hensley. The lawman's office felt suffocating as she placed the evidence on his desk. Tate barely glanced at the wood before dismissing her claims. "Desperate people see what they want to see, Miss Hayes," the marshal said, leaning back in his chair. "This proves nothing except you trespassed on Vega's property again." Word spread quickly through Ridgewater. By evening, Eleanor's discovery had transformed into a tale of a woman grasping at straws. At the general store, she overheard whispers that followed her like shadows. "Imagine the nerve," a woman muttered, "digging through the very barn she torched." Even the town's doctor, who had treated her river-soaked lungs, averted his eyes when she passed. The truth she'd uncovered seemed to evaporate in the face of Cornelius Vega's influence. The wealthy rancher had cultivated his power in Ridgewater for decades, while she remained an outsider whose word carried no weight. "They won't listen," Eleanor told Rhett that night, her voice hollow with defeat. "Not to me." "Then we find evidence they can't ignore," he replied, determination hardening his features. "The truth has a way of rising to the surface, just like you did from that river." Eleanor clutched the piece of charred wood, her only tangible proof. The path to clearing her name seemed impossible, yet she refused to surrender to the current of lies sweeping through the frontier town. The Silver Spur Saloon buzzed with activity as lamplight caught the amber hues of whiskey and the dull gleam of spurs. Smoke hung thick in the air, curling around the rafters, like the rumors that twisted through Ridgewater's social heart. At a corner table sat Levi Boone, cards dancing between his nimble fingers as he dealt another hand to the transfixed locals. "You know," the gambler said, his voice carrying just enough to catch nearby ears, "I heard that Hayes woman was run out of 3 towns before landing here." He paused, allowing the bait to dangle. "They say she left a trail of mysterious fires from Colorado to here." The saloon patrons leaned in, their thirst for gossip stronger than their desire for drink. Eleanor Hayes had become Ridgewater's favorite subject, her story embellished with each retelling. Boone knew precisely how to capitalize on their curiosity. "Marshall Hensley received a telegraph about her last Tuesday," he continued, though no such message had ever arrived. The gambler's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as murmurs rippled through the crowd. Behind the bar, the proprietor wiped glasses with a rag that had seen better days. "Seems mighty convenient that Callahan was there right when she needed saving," he offered, adding fuel to Boone's narrative. "Convenient indeed," Levi agreed, shuffling his deck with practiced precision. Almost like he knew what was coming. The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Rhett's reputation, once solid as Wyoming bedrock, now eroded with each whispered conversation. The rancher's absence from town only fed the speculation. When the Batwing doors swung open and Miriam Callahan entered, conversation faltered. The widow moved purposefully to the bar, purchasing supplies with quiet dignity. Though no one addressed her directly, she felt the weight of their stares. "Mrs. Callahan," Boone called out, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "How fares your brother-in-law's guest?" Miriam's spine stiffened. "Eleanor is recovering well," she answered coolly, "though I wonder how quickly any of us would heal with such venom in the air." Her words landed like stones in still water, creating momentary ripples of shame before the patrons returned to their drinks. As she departed, Cornelius Vega entered, commanding attention with his expensive coat and confident stride. The wealthy rancher nodded to Boone, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "Quite the performance," Vega murmured, sliding a coin across the table. "Keep their minds occupied." Outside, the evening wind carried fragments of conversation into the street, where Eleanor herself stood frozen in the shadows. She had come to town hoping to face her accusers directly, but the weight of their fabrications struck harder than she'd anticipated. The woman pressed a hand against the rough timber of the building, steadying herself against the tide of lies that threatened to drown her once more. The cattle's terrified bellows shattered the midnight silence at Callahan Ranch. Rhett bolted upright in bed, grabbing his revolver before racing outside in his nightclothes. The moonless sky offered little visibility as he squinted into the darkness, making out the shadowy forms of his prized herd scattering in panic across the pasture. "Get the lanterns!" he shouted to his ranch hands who emerged from their quarters. The men scrambled to contain the chaos, but dozens of cattle had already broken through the fence line. their hoofprints clearly visible in the soft earth, leading directly toward the old storage barn where Eleanor Hayes had been sleeping. By dawn, the damage was evident. 3 cattle were lost, likely fallen into ravines in their blind panic. The fence would need extensive repairs, and the scattered herd would take days to fully recover. But it was the trail of evidence that troubled Rhett most. Boot prints, not belonging to any of his men, circled the perimeter where the stampede began. Someone had deliberately spooked his cattle. This wasn't natural, Rhett told Eleanor as they examined the trampled ground. Someone wanted this to happen. Eleanor's face paled as she recognized the implications. The tracks lead to where I've been staying. Convenient, isn't it? Rhett's voice carried an edge of bitterness. Too convenient. By midday, Marshal Tate Hensley arrived, summoned by neighbors who'd spotted the scattered cattle. The lawman made a show of examining the scene, his gaze lingering accusingly on Eleanor. "Seems your guest is bringing you nothing but trouble, Callahan," Tate remarked, making notes in his small leather-bound book. "First Vega's barns, now your herd. Pattern's pretty clear to most folks." "Is it?" Rhett challenged. "Or is someone making it look that way?" The marshal tipped his hat back. "Town's talking. They're saying she's cursed or worse. I'd watch my back if I were you." After Tate departed, Miriam approached Eleanor with worried eyes. "Perhaps you should consider moving on," she suggested quietly, "for everyone's safety." Eleanor stood her ground. "If I leave, they win. Whoever's doing this, they want me gone or hanged." That evening, Rhett discovered a torn piece of fabric caught on a fence post. Expensive material, not the kind his ranch hands would wear. He tucked it away without comment, the pieces of a puzzle slowly forming in his mind. Someone powerful wanted Eleanor blamed and was willing to destroy his livelihood to make it happen. "I know you didn't do this," he told Eleanor as they sat by the fireplace. "And I'm beginning to understand who did." Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "How can you be so sure about me?" "Because," Rhett answered, "desperate people don't create elaborate schemes. They run." The summer sun bore down mercilessly on the Wyoming territory, turning the grasslands into a shimmering sea of gold. Rhett Callahan faced a difficult decision. The cattle needed to be moved to fresh pastures, but leaving Eleanor Hayes alone at the ranch would expose her to the lingering hostility of Ridgewater's residents. "I'm coming with you," Eleanor announced, her voice leaving no room for argument. The determination in her eyes reminded Rhett of the woman who had fought against the Laramie River's current. "I won't hide while others decide my fate." Rhett studied her face, noting the healing scars from that terrible day by the river. "The trail is unforgiving, Eleanor. Even experienced hands struggle." "Then teach me," she replied simply. The first morning of the drive began before dawn. Eleanor's hands, unused to the rough work, blistered and bled as she learned to saddle her horse. The ranch hands watched skeptically, some with open disdain, others with cautious curiosity. By midday, her muscles screamed in protest, but she refused to complain. "Keep your heels down and your back straight," Rhett instructed as they rode alongside the lumbering herd. "The horse feels your confidence, or lack of it." Days blended together under the vast sky. Eleanor fell often, but always remounted without assistance. She learned to read the weather from cloud patterns, to spot a limping steer from 50 yards, to sleep on hard ground without complaint. The trail transformed her, not just physically, as her skin bronzed and her arms strengthened, but in spirit. Around evening campfires, barriers slowly dissolved. Jed, the oldest hand, grudgingly showed her how to mend tack. Young Billy taught her to throw a lasso, laughing good-naturedly at her early failures. Even taciturn Miguel began nodding respectfully when she took the dawn watch without being asked. "You're not what I expected," he admitted one evening, passing her a tin cup of coffee. "What did you expect?" Eleanor asked. "Someone weaker," the ranch hand replied honestly. "Someone who'd break." Rhett observed these changes with quiet satisfaction. One night, as they sat apart from the others, he confessed, "I worried bringing you would be a mistake." "And now?" she asked. "Now I think you belong out here as much as any of us." Eleanor smiled, but her eyes remained watchful. Despite the growing camaraderie, she never forgot the danger awaiting their return. Someone in Ridgewater had orchestrated her downfall, and that threat remained, patient as a snake in tall grass. For now, though, she had found something precious. Not just skills, but respect earned through sweat and perseverance. The cattle drive had been underway for 3 days. The dust of the trail settling into every crease of clothing and line of skin. Eleanor Hayes wiped sweat from her brow as she dismounted, her muscles aching from hours in the saddle. She was learning quickly, though the ranch hands still watched her with a mixture of curiosity and lingering suspicion. While the men tended to the herd, Eleanor volunteered to organize supplies in one of the wagons. As she rearranged sacks of beans and coffee, her hand brushed against the leather satchel tucked beneath a tarp. Curiosity piqued, she glanced around before opening it. Inside lay several documents, land deeds, contracts, and correspondence that Rhett had brought along to handle business at their destination. But among them, a folded newspaper clipping caught her eye. It detailed insurance policies recently purchased in Ridgewater, with Cornelius Vega's name prominently featured. "What are you doing?" Rhett's voice startled her. Eleanor turned, the paper clutched in her trembling hand. Vega insured his barns 3 months before the fire, for twice their value. The rancher's expression darkened as he took the clipping, his eyes scanning the words. "Where did you find this?" "It was with your papers," she explained. "Don't you see what this means? He had every reason to want those barns destroyed." Rhett ran a hand through his dust-covered hair. "That's why he pushed so hard to blame you. A convenient scapegoat." That night, while the cattle settled under starlight, Eleanor sat apart from the others, the weight of her discovery pressing on her conscience. She watched Rhett speaking with his men, their faces illuminated by firelight. These people had risked everything to shelter her. The ranch, their livelihoods, their standing in the community, all were in jeopardy. "Troubled thoughts?" Rhett asked, settling beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "Use this information against Vega. He'll come after you with everything he has," Eleanor whispered. "Your land, your cattle, maybe worse." He nodded slowly. "Likely so. Then perhaps it's better if I just disappear," she suggested, her voice catching. "Take this evidence to another town. Start fresh somewhere else." Rhett studied her face in the firelight. "Running won't bring justice, and Vega will just find someone else to victimize." Eleanor clutched the tin cup between her palms, drawing warmth from it as the night air cooled. "Is justice worth destroying everything you've built? Everything your family depends on?" The question hung between them, unanswered, as the fire crackled and the vast Wyoming sky spread overhead. Eleanor knew that whatever choice they made, nothing would ever be the same. The evidence in her possession was both weapon and burden, the key to her freedom and possibly the destruction of the only people who had shown her kindness. The autumn rains fell without mercy, turning the Laramie River from a steady flow into a raging torrent that spilled over its banks and claimed the lower pastures. Eleanor Hayes stood at the edge of Rhett Callahan's property, watching muddy water creep across what had once been fertile grazing land. The flooding came just as the cattle needed the last good feed before winter's harsh grip. "Third field this week," Rhett said, appearing beside her. His weathered face showed the strain of calculating losses that seemed to multiply by the day. "We'll have to move the herd higher up." Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight of his words. Every misfortune that befell Ridgewater since her arrival had somehow become her burden to bear. In town yesterday, she'd overheard whispers that followed her like shadows. "That Hayes woman brought nothing but trouble," they said. "First fire, now floods. She's cursed, mark my words." The rancher seemed to read her thoughts. "Don't let them get to you," he said. his voice low but firm. People always need someone to blame when times get hard, but the blame was becoming dangerous. 3 days ago, a group of townspeople had confronted Marshal Tate Hensley outside the general store, demanding he drive Eleanor from Ridgewater before winter set in. The lawman, still in Cornelius Vega's pocket, had been all too willing to consider their request. Only Rhett's intervention, his hand resting casually on his firearm and his quiet reminder that the law required evidence, not superstition, had prevented her immediate expulsion. "The river's taken the south fence," Eleanor said, changing the subject. "I can help repair it tomorrow." Rhett studied her face. "You don't have to prove yourself every day, Eleanor." "Yes, I do," she replied. "To them, to you, to myself." Later that evening, as they sat in the ranch house kitchen, Miriam served coffee with tight-lipped concern. The widow had grown increasingly uneasy as tensions in town mounted. Every trip to church or the general store brought back fresh stories of anger directed at her brother-in-law and his guest. "Cornelius was at the Silver Spur today," Miriam said carefully. "He's telling anyone who'll listen that our misfortunes will continue until I'm gone," Eleanor finished. The rancher's cup hit the table with a sharp crack. "This land has seen floods before and will again. You're not leaving unless you choose to." Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault, and the river that had nearly claimed Eleanor's life now threatened to wash away what little security she had found. Like the rising waters, the town's hostility was reaching a breaking point, and Rhett couldn't hold back either force forever. The winter wind rattled the windows of the Callahan ranch house as Miriam Callahan stood in the doorway of Eleanor's room, her face etched with worry lines that seemed deeper than usual. Eleanor Hayes looked up from mending a torn shirt, immediately sensing the conversation to come would not be pleasant. "May I speak with you?" Miriam asked, her voice soft but strained. She closed the door behind her, keeping her children from overhearing. Eleanor nodded, setting aside her needlework. The widow moved to sit on the edge of the bed, her hands fidgeting with her apron. "I'm grateful for what you've done for my children," Miriam began, choosing her words carefully. "The way you've taught Emma to read better, how you help with chores without being asked. But I need to speak plainly about Rhett." Eleanor felt her chest tighten. "What about him?" "He's risking everything for you," Miriam said, her voice breaking slightly. "Not just his reputation or the ranch, but our entire family's future. The children and I, we depend on this place, on him." She looked directly at Eleanor, her eyes glistening. "Since my husband, James, died, Rhett has carried us all. If he falls, we all do." Outside, the wind howled louder, as if emphasizing her point. Eleanor moved to the window, watching snowflakes swirl across the yard, where just yesterday, Rhett had taught her to properly throw a lasso. "Cornelius Vega has connections beyond Ridgewater," Miriam continued. "He's already turned half the town against us. The feed store won't extend credit anymore. Emma came home crying yesterday because her friend's mother forbade them from playing together." Eleanor turned, her throat tight. "I never wanted to bring this trouble to your door." "I know that," Miriam acknowledged, her tone softening, "but intentions don't feed children or protect a home." The weight of these words settled between them. Eleanor thought of the evidence she'd gathered, the charred timber hidden beneath her bed, the suspicions about Marshal Hensley's corruption. Was justice worth the cost being exacted from this family? "What would you have me do?" Eleanor asked finally. Miriam stood, straightening her skirts. "I don't know, but Rhett won't listen to me. He sees something in you worth fighting for." She paused at the door. "I just pray that whatever it is doesn't destroy him, destroy us all in the process." After Miriam left, Eleanor remained by the window, watching as Rhett emerged from the barn, his broad shoulders hunched against the cold. The rancher paused, looking toward the house as if sensing her gaze. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. Eleanor turned away first, her resolve faltering under the burden of Miriam's fear. Perhaps seeking justice was selfish, when others would pay the price. The pews of Ridgewater's modest church creaked under the weight of tension that Sunday morning. Eleanor Hayes sat beside Rhett Callahan, feeling the heat of sideways glances burning through her Sunday best. Pastor Williams had barely finished his sermon on forgiveness when Cornelius Vega stood to announce a special prayer for the protection of the town's property, a thinly veiled reference to the barn burning. Eleanor's hands trembled in her lap. She caught Rhett's eye, and something in his steady gaze gave her strength. Before she could second-guess herself, she rose to her feet. "I'd like to speak if I may," she said, her voice barely audible at first. The congregation fell silent, shock evident on their faces. No one had expected the accused to address them directly. "Many of you only know me as the woman pulled from the river," Eleanor continued, her voice growing firmer. "The arsonist, the outsider." She paused, scanning the faces before her, some hostile, others merely curious. "But before that day, I was just a woman seeking honest work, with hopes no different than yours." She recounted her arrival in Ridgewater, the brief employment at the general store, and then the night of the fire, how she'd been walking back from delivering mending when she saw the flames. "I ran toward the barn, not away from it. Would a guilty person do that?" Miriam Callahan shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her children pressed close against her sides. The widow's eyes held conflict, sympathy warring with fear. "I've lost everything because of an accusation," Eleanor continued. "My reputation, my chance at a livelihood, nearly my life." Her voice cracked slightly. "And I understand your fear. When bad things happen, we want someone to blame." The few townspeople lowered their eyes, unable to meet her direct gaze. "But I ask you this. What kind of community drowns its problems rather than seeking truth? What kind of justice condemns without evidence?" The marshal shifted uncomfortably against the back wall, his badge catching the light from the stained glass windows. "I'm grateful to Mr. Callahan for saving my life," she said, nodding toward Rhett. "But I'm not asking for your protection or charity. I'm asking for the chance to prove my innocence." An elderly woman in the front pew dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Beside her, a shopkeeper who had once refused to serve Eleanor now looked thoughtful rather than angry. "Judge me by my actions, not by whispers," Eleanor finished, her voice steady despite her racing heart. As she sat down, the silence held for several long seconds. Then Sarah Miller, the schoolteacher, stood up and simply said, "I believe we should listen to her." It wasn't a victory, but as murmurs rippled through the congregation, some argumentative, others contemplative, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced since being dragged to the river. Hope. Rhett Callahan stood in the shadow of the livery stable, watching Marshal Tate Hensley exit the back door of the Silver Spur. The rancher had spent weeks piecing together fragments of conversation, tracking the lawman's movements after Eleanor's near drowning. What he discovered turned his stomach. "Saw you with Vega again last night," Rhett said, stepping forward as Tate startled. "Funny how often you two meet behind closed doors." The marshal's hand twitched near his firearm. "Just doing my job, Callahan. Something you might try instead of harboring criminals. Is that what they're calling justice these days?" Rhett moved closer, his voice low. "I know about the money, Tate. $50 a month to keep Eleanor's name blackened and Vega's clean." The lawman's face drained of color. "You're talking nonsense. The bank teller remembers your deposits, always the day after you meet with Cornelius." Rhett watched realization dawn in the marshal's eyes. "How much was Eleanor's life worth? Was it enough?" Tate's shoulders sagged, his authority crumbling. "You don't understand what it's like. 20 years wearing this badge, and what do I have? A rented room and the respect of drunks." Vega offered security. At the cost of an innocent woman? She was nobody, a drifter. The town needed someone to blame. Rhett fought the urge to grab the man by his collar. She has a name, Eleanor Hayes, and she deserves justice. Later, at the Callahan Ranch, Rhett paced the kitchen floor while Miriam prepared supper. If I expose Tate, Vega will retaliate. He owns half the cattlemen in the territory. His sister-in-law placed a steaming plate before him. And if you don't, Eleanor remains guilty in everyone's eyes. Rhett pushed the food away. Vega's influence stretches beyond Ridgewater. He could turn every rancher against us, dry up our water rights, block cattle drives. You're not just deciding for yourself, Miriam reminded him. My children, the hands who depend on this ranch. Eleanor entered silently, having heard enough. I won't ask you to sacrifice everything, Rhett. Not for me. The rancher looked up, his resolve hardening. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about what kind of town Ridgewater becomes, what kind of man I am. That night, Rhett wrote letters to neighboring ranchers he trusted, detailing Tate's corruption and Vega's manipulation. He sealed each with wax, knowing that once delivered, there would be no turning back. Justice has a price, he whispered to himself as he stacked the letters, and I'm willing to pay it. Winter descended upon Ridgewater with an unforgiving hand. Snow blanketed the Wyoming territory in pristine white, transforming the rugged landscape into a hushed wilderness. The Laramie River, once a churning force that had nearly claimed Eleanor Hayes's life, now lay partially frozen, its current slowed to a whisper beneath sheets of ice. At Callahan Ranch, Rhett worked tirelessly to ensure his cattle survived the harsh season. The rancher's breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he hauled feed to his livestock. The animals huddled together for warmth. Eleanor had proven herself invaluable during these difficult months, rising before dawn to help with chores, despite the biting cold that aggravated the scars on her hands. Painful reminders of that terrible day by the river. Word traveled quickly through town, carried on the same bitter wind that rattled windows and doors. A railroad inspector would arrive within the fortnight to evaluate Ridgewater as a potential hub for the expanding Western Line. Such news might have brought celebration in warmer times, promising prosperity and growth for the frontier settlement. Instead, it sparked a dangerous ambition in Cornelius Vega. The wealthy rancher saw opportunity in the inspector's visit, a chance to consolidate his grip on Ridgewater once and for all. In the warmth of his sprawling home, Vega summoned his allies, including Marshal Tate Hensley, whose loyalty had been purchased months ago. The railroad means money, Vega told them, swirling amber whiskey in his glass, and money means power. But we need more land, specifically Callahan's property. It borders the most suitable path for the tracks. Tate shifted uncomfortably. Rhett won't sell. He's made that clear enough. Then we'll make him desperate enough to have no choice, Vega replied, his voice as cold as the landscape outside. That woman he harbors remains a liability. Perhaps it's time the town remembers why they wanted her gone in the first place. Meanwhile, Miriam Callahan watched the snow fall through frosted windows, her children asleep beside the hearth. She sensed trouble brewing beyond their isolated ranch. They won't leave us be, she warned her brother-in-law one evening. Not with the railroad coming. Vega has wanted this land since before Thomas died. Rhett nodded grimly, knowing she spoke the truth. The coming of the railroad inspector had raised the stakes in their ongoing struggle. What had begun as one act of defiance, saving Eleanor from drowning, had evolved into a battle for survival against Ridgewater's most powerful man. As winter tightened its grip, Eleanor and Rhett prepared for the storm they knew was coming, one far more dangerous than any blizzard the Wyoming territory could deliver. Levi Boone slid into the chair across from Rhett Callahan at the far corner of the Silver Spur, his weathered deck of cards dancing between nimble fingers. The gambler's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, darted around the saloon before settling on Rhett. "Heard you've been asking questions about that fire," Levi said, his voice barely audible above the piano's tinny melody. "Might be I know something worth hearing." Rhett leaned forward, Skepticism etched across his face. The rancher had spent weeks gathering scraps of evidence, all leading nowhere. Eleanor's name remained tarnished, and Cornelius Vega's grip on Ridgewater tightened with each passing day. "Speak plainly or leave me be," Rhett said. The gambler's lips curled into a knowing smile. "I was camped by Vega's property that night. Saw 3 men, his men, carrying oil lamps into that barn. Heard them talking about insurance money." Levi shuffled his cards with practiced precision. "Could be I'm willing to stand before the town and say as much." Eleanor, who had been watching from nearby, approached their table with cautious steps. Her eyes narrowed with distrust as she regarded the man who had spread countless rumors about her since that terrible day at the river. "Why come forward now?" she asked. "A man waits for the right moment to play his hand," Levi replied, cutting the deck with one hand. "And that moment has a price." Rhett's jaw tightened. "How much?" The gambler's laugh was dry as prairie dust. "Not interested in coin, Callahan. I want something worth my while." He gestured toward the window, toward the distant hills where Rhett's ranch stood. "1 game, your deed against my testimony. You're asking me to gamble everything my family built," Rhett said, his voice dangerously low. Levi shrugged. "I'm offering you the only chance you'll get to save the woman you risked your life for. Vega's bought the marshal, half the town council, and enough guns to make sure nobody speaks against him." He leaned closer. "But he can't buy what I saw with my own eyes." Eleanor placed her hand on Rhett's shoulder, feeling the tension beneath his coat. "It's too much risk," she whispered. "We'll find another way." But the rancher's gaze remained fixed on Levi. "When?" "Tomorrow night. 1 game, 5-card draw. Winner takes all." The gambler stood, pocketing his cards. "Choose wisely, Callahan. Some things are worth more than land." After Levi departed, Rhett and Eleanor sat in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down like winter snow on a weak roof. The fate of everything, her freedom, his legacy, perhaps the soul of Ridgewater itself, would rest on the turn of a card. "I won't let you do this for me," Eleanor finally said. Rhett looked at her, determination hardening his features. "It stopped being just for you a long time ago." The Silver Spur Saloon buzzed with tension as lamplight cast long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Rhett Callahan settled into his chair, facing Levi Boone and Cornelius Vega across the green felt table. The wealthy rancher's lips curled into a smile that never reached his eyes, while the gambler shuffled cards with practiced precision, gold rings flashing with each movement. "Stakes are simple," Levi announced, his voice carrying through the packed establishment. "Callahan Ranch against my testimony." He dealt the first hand with theatrical flair, cards slapping against the table. Eleanor Hayes stood near the bar, knuckles white around her glass. She had witnessed too many moments when fate hung by a thread, but never one where that thread was a playing card. The woman caught Miriam's worried glance from across the room. Rhett's sister-in-law had reluctantly come, unwilling to let her brother-in-law face this might alone. Marshal Tate Hensley leaned against the wall, his badge catching the light. His presence was more threat than protection, his loyalty purchased long ago by Vega's money. "Your bet, Callahan," Vega prompted, pushing a stack of coins forward. His confidence stemmed from years of getting his way in Ridgewater. Rhett studied his cards, face unreadable. The rancher had learned patience from harsh winters and unforgiving summers. He matched the bet without comment. Townsfolk pressed closer, their breath fogging the windows. Some had come hoping to see Rhett's downfall, others silently praying for justice to finally find purchase in their community. The railroad inspector sat nearby, observing everything with keen interest. Hours passed. Fortunes shifted. Glasses emptied and filled again. Rhett won small pots, lost others, his expression never changing. Eleanor moved closer, sensing the game nearing its climax. "All in," Vega finally declared, shoving his entire stake forward. Time to settle this, once and for all. The gambler matched without hesitation. Both men turned to Rhett, who sat motionless, considering the cards in his hand. "Your ranch and your reputation," Levi reminded him, "against the truth that could save her." He nodded toward Eleanor. Rhett looked up, meeting Eleanor's gaze across the smoky room. In that moment, something passed between them, a recognition that some gambles transcended cards and coins. "All in," he said quietly, pushing forward everything he had built and protected for years. The saloon fell silent as the three men revealed their hands, cards that would determine not just ownership of land, but the very soul of Ridgewater itself. Eleanor held her breath, knowing that whatever happened next would forever change their lives, for better or worse. The tension in the Silver Spur saloon was thick enough to cut with a knife as cards slapped against the worn table. Rhett Callahan's weathered face betrayed nothing, while Cornelius Vega's confident smirk grew with each hand. The final cards were about to be dealt when the saloon doors burst open. Eleanor Hayes stood framed in the doorway, her eyes blazing with determination. The scars from her near drowning seemed to fade as she strode forward, clutching a leather satchel. The crowd parted instinctively as she approached the table. "This game ends now," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "The truth won't wait for one more hand." The railroad inspector, Mr. Whitley, who had been observing from a corner table, straightened his posture. Eleanor carefully placed the charred piece of timber on the table, disrupting the neat arrangement of cards and chips. "This wood tells a story," she said, addressing the entire room rather than just the players. "The fire started from inside the barn, not outside. No arsonist would have access to this particular beam." She then produced a stack of documents, sliding them toward the inspector. "And these insurance papers show that Mr. Vega increased his policy just 3 weeks before the fire. He stood to gain 5 times what those barns were worth." Vega lunged for the papers, but Levi Boone's hand shot out, pinning the wealthy rancher's wrist to the table. "I'd listen if I were you," the gambler drawled. "The lady's making more sense than you have all year." The inspector adjusted his spectacles and examined the documents. The saloon had fallen completely silent, every eye fixed on the unfolding scene. Even the bartender had stopped polishing glasses. "These appear to be legitimate," Mr. Whitley confirmed, his voice cutting through the silence. "And rather damning." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Townsfolk who had once demanded Eleanor's drowning now exchanged uncertain glances. Marshal Tate Hensley shifted uncomfortably by the door, his hand hovering near his firearm. "You're believing a woman who should be dead?" Vega snarled, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "We're believing evidence," Rhett replied, calmly, standing to join Eleanor. "Something this town forgot to consider before trying to drown an innocent woman." The railroad inspector gathered the documents carefully. "I came to evaluate Ridgewater for progress, not corruption. This matter requires proper investigation." Vega's face drained of color as he watched his influence dissolve before his eyes. Several ranchers who had once backed him stepped away, unwilling to be associated with such scandal. Eleanor stood tall beside Rhett, her shoulders squared. For the first time since being forced into the Laramie River, she could breathe freely. The truth had finally broken the surface, and Ridgewater would never be the same. The cold Wyoming wind cut through Main Street as Marshal Tate Hensley stood with his back to the jailhouse, hand hovering near his firearm. His weathered face betrayed the conflict within. A man caught between duty and the bribes that had lined his pockets for too long. "I won't be arresting Cornelius today or any day," the marshal announced, his voice carrying across the gathering crowd. "There ain't enough evidence." Eleanor Hayes stepped forward, the scars from the river still visible on her wrists where the ropes had cut deep. "The evidence is right here," she said, holding up the charred timber and documents. "Everyone has seen it. Everyone knows the truth now." The townsfolk of Ridgewater murmured their agreement. Faces that had once twisted with hatred toward Eleanor now turned questioning glances toward Vega and the marshal. The railroad inspector stood among them, notebook in hand, watching the frontier justice unfold with keen interest. Rhett Callahan moved beside Eleanor, his presence solid as the mountains that framed the territory. "This ends today, Tate," he said simply. The rancher's quiet dignity spoke louder than any shout could have. Cornelius Vega emerged from the crowd, flanked by 2 hired guns. "This woman destroyed my property," he insisted, though the lie fell flat in the winter air. "Marshal, do your duty." "Your duty," echoed Miriam Callahan from the edge of the crowd, her children clutched close. "Or your conscience, Marshal Hensley." The lawman's gaze darted between Vega's cold stare and the faces of townsfolk he'd known for years. People who had trusted him to uphold justice, not sell it to the highest bidder. Old Samuel Porter, who ran the general store, stepped forward. "I was there when they threw her in the river, didn't say nothing then." The shopkeeper removed his hat. "That shame's on me, not again." One by one, others joined. The blacksmith, the schoolteacher, even the bartender from the Silver Spur. They formed a line between Vega and Eleanor, a human barrier of conscience awakened. Tate's hand trembled on his weapon. "Don't make me choose sides here." "You already did," Rhett replied, "every time you looked the other way for Vega's money." The marshal's shoulders sagged as the weight of years of compromise finally became too heavy to bear. He glanced at the badge on his chest, then at the town he'd failed. "Ridgewater deserves better," he whispered, almost to himself. The standoff stretched taut as a wire. In the silence, the town held its breath, poised between its past and its future, between mob rule and true justice. The flames reached skyward, painting the night with violent orange hues. Cornelius Vega had slipped away from the standoff on Main Street, his final vengeance igniting Rhett's barn in a desperate act of defiance. The crackling inferno devoured the wooden structure, threatening to consume everything Rhett Callahan had built. "The horses!" Rhett shouted, his face illuminated by the dancing fire. He froze momentarily as memories crashed over him, his brother trapped in flames years ago, screams that still haunted his dreams. The rancher's hands trembled, but he forced himself forward. Eleanor Hayes grabbed his arm. "We'll save them together," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. The woman who had once been dragged to the Laramie River to die now stood as his equal, her determination matching his own. They rushed toward the burning structure. Bandanas pressed against their mouths. Inside, the terrified whinnies of trapped horses pierced through the roar of the blaze. Rhett led the way, navigating through familiar paths now transformed into corridors of fire. Eleanor followed, unflinching as embers rained down around them. "This way," he called, reaching the first stall. Together they worked to free each animal, guiding them through the smoke toward safety. When a burning beam crashed down, blocking their path, Rhett hesitated, the same moment of paralysis that had cost his brother's life. Eleanor gripped his hand. "Not this time," she whispered. Something broke free within him. The rancher surged forward, finding strength he thought lost forever. They moved as one, rescuing the last of the livestock as the barn's support beams groaned ominously above them. Outside, Miriam organized the ranch hands into a bucket brigade from the well. The widow's face was streaked with soot, but her eyes held fierce determination as she directed the efforts to contain the blaze. When the last horse galloped to safety, Rhett and Eleanor emerged from the inferno, collapsing onto the cold ground as the structure finally surrendered to the flames. They watched, breathless and exhausted, as the fire consumed what could be rebuilt, but spared what could not be replaced. "He took my barn, but not my courage," Rhett said, his voice hoarse from smoke. Eleanor nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. Some fires purify rather than destroy. As dawn broke over Ridgewater, the smoldering remains of the barn stood as testament to Vega's malice. But around it, something unexpected had taken root. Townsfolk who had once condemned Eleanor now worked alongside the ranch hands, clearing debris and offering support. The fire that was meant to break them had instead forged something stronger. In each other's eyes, Rhett and Eleanor saw not the ashes of what was lost, but the promise of what could still be built. The first snow of winter blanketed Ridgewater in a pristine quiet, the white powder softening the jagged edges of a town once torn by suspicion. Eleanor Hayes stood on the porch of the Callahan Ranch, her breath clouding in the crisp air as she watched flakes settle on fence posts that had weathered both seasons and scandal. The scars on her wrists, remnants of ropes that had bound her that fateful day at the river, had faded to pale lines, much like the town's memory of its own cruelty. Inside, Rhett stoked the fire, his weathered hands moving with purpose. The rancher had lost cattle and nearly his reputation, but the truth had prevailed. Cornelius Vega now faced charges for arson and attempted murder, his influence crumbling like the charred timbers of his own scheme. Marshall Tate Hensley had resigned in disgrace, replaced by a deputy who promised to uphold justice without favor to wealth or status. "Still can't believe it's over," Eleanor said as she stepped back inside, brushing snow from her shoulders. Rhett looked up, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Not over, just beginning differently." Miriam arrived later that afternoon with her children, bringing fresh-baked bread and cautious smiles. The widow's initial distrust had transformed into a tentative friendship with Eleanor. The children, once forbidden from speaking to that woman, now eagerly showed her their drawings of horses and snow angels. "The railroads confirmed the new station," Miriam mentioned over supper. "They're saying Ridgewater might double in size by next winter." "Growth without conscience isn't progress," Rhett replied, passing the potatoes. "But I reckon this town's learned something about looking beneath the surface." In town, the Silver Spur Saloon hummed with new stories. Levi Boone had departed after the poker game, his pockets lined with enough winnings to start fresh elsewhere. The gambler had played his final hand in Ridgewater, leaving behind a town forever changed by his reluctant testimony. As December deepened, Eleanor received an unexpected letter, an offer to teach at the newly expanded schoolhouse come spring. The community that had once tried to drown her now sought her strength to help shape its future. That evening, as lantern light glowed against the falling snow, Eleanor and Rhett walked the property line together. Their shoulders occasionally brushed, comfortable in a silence built on shared struggle and mutual respect. "They tried to make me disappear," she said finally. "Instead, they made me belong." Rhett took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. The river that had nearly claimed them both now lay frozen in the distance, its rage temporarily stilled by winter's command. "Some currents you can't fight," he said softly, "and some you shouldn't try to." In the hush of winter, Ridgewater remembered not its worst moment, but its redemption, found in the courage of two souls who had refused to be swept away.